Welcome to another Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are playing,
the time has arrived.
Once again, Street Fighter 5 as always for our Mondays. But in order to find us today, you are looking for potentially two different lounges altogether. But in this case, the one you can see on screen now, it is our 3 rounds first to 2 character select on this week, because we are going to be doing rotation in-house. We haven't been gathering up as much as usual due to the situation in the world recently, but today we are in one place, and that means we may be making use of this to have different people play from this account. That of course means you're going to get to see at least 3 people, probably. And we'll change when one of us loses, most likely.
Round 2. Fight.
We're all going to be working on different things as well, of course. In order to, therefore, limit the number of people we will all be facing, there is a different number of people in this lounge. We've been doing 8 recently. Today is only 6, because we expect a lot of the rest of the team to be somewhere else. Since the team does have different controller configurations, it's a little bit easier to not change things until one of us has lost.
Round 1.
So if we are on a win streak, you're likely to see the same character repeatedly. as for me, it's always the same. I have to fight zoners. I just fight zoners all of the time, I think. I think last time I fought someone who wasn't was like, it was one G. This is technically fine, but it does mean that I have to practice a lot on catching up with people who want to get away from me.
Time to return to harmony. Seraphic wing!
And, as I've mentioned multiple times on these streams, the better thing to do in that situation is nothing at all. But as I'm not really planning to try hard to win this time, it's not going to matter so much if I actually try to work on offense and chase the opponent some more, as usual.
It's go time.
It's actually important to build up this skill over time, primarily because if you are used to playing this game now, in most places you can play Street Fighter V in the world, the majority of your opponents are going to try to upset you by running away if they've realized that you know what you're doing. This is a strong tactic for causing you to lose your focus, flinch, or in some way give them an advantage by changing some aspect of your own flow. I really should have changed that V-trigger. But honestly, in this matchup, in this type of matchup, it's very seldom important what V-trigger is being used, because once again, the main thing you're going to see, the main thing you need to factor is, does the opponent actually take any action other than long-range combat or jumping?
Fight.
The answer is usually no. And if you really want to win, you just don't do anything back. And you can't really necessarily blame people for this either, because if your skills in actually playing footsies are too strong, any action they attempt to take tends to result in them getting hurt and not you. Here's a good example. The correct answer to this matchup against this particular player is to never go in on Wake Up, because they haven't managed, as I continually say over many streams, most people don't manage to hurt me in neutral. Meaning that the best thing to do is to stay still. But
You lose.
if the opponent's flow involves moving forward and they're consistently exposed to that from this side, they don't really have another strategy or a method of winning the fight anyway. Meaning that that is their optimal strategy, to move away and to avoid having to deal with, because Chun-Li's footsies are extremely strong. You don't really win against her with them most of the time. You do this, but it's not really strictly speaking a win condition, because that is an execution test, but not one that I'm gonna fail every time. So we give the opponent something to do by approaching. Otherwise, the fight will quickly devolve into basically nothing. You need to build up your own skills in this matter by doing so. simply because if you don't, you will eventually find someone who manages to get a life lead and sits on it in that way. We see this quite often actually. There's Civic Bison, for example, that's really particularly annoying with it. And at the same time, it's important to build up your own targeting skills for these things. For example, that should have been done differently. So there does come a point where understanding how to not only get in, but also to stay calm in the face of the mistakes you make while doing that become critical to your success in this game. If your defense is particularly good, or your character has an uppercut to get you out of certain situations, pushing your opponent into an emotional state where this matters is useful, but a lot of the time it's not going to change anything in the long term. They are going to eventually bait it, and the big damage that comes from that can really put a cramp in anything you want to do.
Let's do this.
In general, because of the way the game works, offense is limited by the corner. If you cannot push your opponent back to the corner, or if you don't know what to do once you've pushed them there, it's difficult to get much advantage. Sagat versus Akuma, for example. I'm not figuring there that I should have picked Sagat, but there we go. Sakura can be played in mostly the same way, and in fact most of our experience is that most Sakura do play this way. Most Sakura at the levels that we encounter them do back off a lot, attempt to get projectiles, and when footsies does happen, it often involves doing uppercuts to get the opponent off guard and frustrate them. Now, for Akuma, this isn't usually so hard, but because Sakura can do the projectile upward, a lot of his jumping movement doesn't work as well, and because she can charge it, he has to react very quickly to the projectiles. He can't just parry them or similar things. Tatsu can help, but a lot of the time that's what the opponent is waiting for anyway. So here we have the classic moment. Can you deal with this and actually get in? Most of the time, the optimal thing to do against this sort of player is to move to mid-screen, or move when you found yourself far away. You fight the similar way to how you do against Delson. You get far away, jump once, and then stop your approach. This is because most people respond to the first jump as if there is going to be something else happening. And you get to assess your time, even if it doesn't necessarily gain you anything. Understanding that the other player doesn't necessarily even want to play footsies can itself be a strong advantage to you. Getting in is therefore a matter of teaching them a specific set of actions you are likely to take, but not the timing that you're likely to take them in. And from there, just expect them to jump. Because if the player is intending to overwhelm you, they must jump. This goes particularly for people who have spent a lot of time practicing playing footsies just standardly, without thinking too hard about it. This carries double for when you actually know the opponent's character fairly well. You're just going to automatically play footsies correctly in a lot of situations. Depending on your opponent, this can cause some important timings for your V reversal, but it's not as easy as deciding that. One of the hardest aspects of this, therefore, is recognizing when the opponent has this style of play so that you can change your mindset. As your mindset is the hardest thing to change. We all turn on the game with the expectation or wish to play a particular way. In fact, if you are too into it, you can just end up frustrated. And if you don't, you end up like me. Like, I don't generally think I want to turn on Street Fighter. Not because I hate the game, or actually even that I don't find it fun most of the time. It's just the expectation that there will eventually be that person that makes me spend 90 seconds literally just chasing them around the screen. This can be fun, but it requires a change in mindset toward that aspect of the game being fun, which isn't how I start in the morning, let's say, when I turn the game on. I'm looking for cool stuff happening, people countering other options with cool, difficult, or impressive things. I'm not usually thinking about the technical side of chasing an opponent for a long time.
Sakura wins.
But in this case, we already know that that's where we are. And it's important to recognize that just because your opponent has not necessarily gone far away from you, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't play like this or that they don't want to play like this. A large part of it is whether or not they hit any of what you would expect as footsie buttons in neutral, or ever walk, really.
Let's do this.
And this is something you often have to review by checking into things. Here we have a character who is not necessarily similar in that way, but can once again be played the same way, and it's a perfect time to talk about how to recognize this happening. Watch carefully as to whether or not, because Honda is a character with good buttons for neutral. They're not spectacular, but he's hard to whiff punish. He's really hard to whiff punish, actually.
Round one.
And he has a lot of good timings on the moves. They're not necessarily strong in pressure, but now we get to see something that is more akin to footsies. But just because it looks like footsies doesn't always mean it is. In this case, I will say, yeah, sure, it is footsies. But note that the opponent still hasn't had any reason to walk. There was one micro walk there, so I can't claim that entirely.
Round two. Fight.
But if you were to think about the options, the likeliest thing to happen, jumping is the most likely thing to happen. Meaning that technically, Suntir should be basically always primed to uppercut. If this were a bot, one would just count the number of uppercuts and just do 10 uppercuts and win. That would be the whole thing. It's not going to be enough to win here, but definitely there was a huge benefit here for 10 uppercuts. Regardless of whether or not the opponent takes particularly long to get around to doing it, this expectation you should have at a moment of neutral happening is still, my opponent will jump. Until you have uppercut a player like this at least 16 times, they'll jump, because the thing that causes them to jump is not specifically thinking that they will get away with it, but the fact that without it, it's impossible to overload you, and that means that only footsies is the functional way of winning. That, however, is a functional way to overload someone as well. If you can catch them with a move that otherwise they would not figure was going to hit them, or they were not expecting because it wasn't a great idea to do, you'll find that people spend a lot of time thinking, why did you do that? And then when you do it again, they spend even more time thinking, why did you do that? Honda is good about this, as is Blanca, because the moves that they use for this aren't necessarily all that punishable. They're kind of reactable, but not really very punishable. But here's a good point as to why you wouldn't expect Honda to keep doing that move. It's relatively easy for Akuma to beat it by just hitting Red Fireball. It's also a move that you can throw him out of afterwards if you think you're going to get away with it, or go for a low because he has to try to get away from another thing. It's not super hard to deal with the move. The main thing that's hard to deal with is the opponent's willingness to do it as much as they do.
Honda wins. It's go time. Let's do this. Karin Kanzuki. Honda. You see?
The situation was harder for Karin because her anti-airs and air-to-airs are not as easy to do consistently against Honda. And she has no real good counters to him just doing the headbutt.
Fight.
It's similar to fighting Ken in one way, but overall, she has to spend a lot more time than most characters measuring the range Honda is at, so that when he does jump, it's easier to deal with. Her movement speed does help a lot here though. In other words, she is more so trying, unlike Akuma, to stand at a specific spot in front of him and then do nothing. Building up V-meter is also helpful for that reason. Pond is one of the few characters who has very, very little way to stop Karin from just parrying whenever he does certain things.
Round 2.
But it is generally true that Kanzuki Dynasty gets stressed quickly, and getting stressed against Honda means that you're basically going to lose almost all of the reactions you need to have in order to win the match, or even to just prevent it from cascading. Here we see that, for example, she's already started to jump. It's not so much that jumping is unnecessary, but that the timing for the jump isn't the timing you need for it. The mindfulness disappears because there's no way to do with it. Similarly, you can tell stress coming in because of the fact that his stuff isn't really that hard to parry, it's fairly reactable. But once you're on edge, it's very difficult to actually do it. Especially if you haven't practiced against Hondabot that much, and honestly it doesn't matter if you have, because the entire point is once again to overload the opponent. This is partially why, as we've said before, players in gold rank who end up stuck there have difficulty beating players in platinum and diamond, because those players don't get overloaded. That's basically the difference between their skill sets. If you don't get overloaded by this style of play from the gold player, you aren't going to lose to them very often. The problem with this style of thinking about it is that there is a lot to be done, and it's never as simple as, well, okay, I should walk to exactly this spot, because obviously the character doesn't have no options, and just straight up let me walk forward until I reached my spot will get you hit by their longest button.
Round 2.
Meaning it's never cut and dry. You also have to jump sometimes yourself while going in, and sometimes you have to dash, because you can't tell what your opponent is going to do, and almost all of the time, brains like to counter the last thing the opponent did. This is partly how we get stressed. You see the opponent hit X button so many times, you go, okay, I know how to beat that button, and that is almost exactly the same moment that their mind will go, okay, time to hit a different button. Super frustrating by most standards.
You lose.
This is the aspect of Street Fighter that our bots don't help with in any way, because this is entirely a psychological thing. Bots can create the ability to look at a situation that repeats itself and work on the response,
It's go time.
but it's generally not going to work out that well. Well, it looks like they have had enough winning for today. As noted before,
Let's do
the
this.
team is a little split at the moment. If you want to find the other half, you should probably just look for DeWolf. But if you want to join this lounge, bear in mind once again that it is 3 rounds first to 2 with character select on. It is in fact part of the reason why we may stop having these specific types of lounges soon. Not necessarily that we won't have lounges on Mondays, but our previous method of doing this was basically gather the whole team together in one lounge and have everyone work on whatever is holding them back. But right now, main things holding people back is this aspect of it. You can see from watching this match, for example, there's a lot more, okay, how do I manage to make this movement? And a lot less using a strategy meant specifically to overwhelm the opponent emotionally. Most people who don't enjoy, let's call it bullying for the sake, lack of a better word, because it really, you can say it is sometimes, but it depends on the skill levels in question. Most people who don't enjoy doing that, who have to play against each other a lot, don't spend a lot of time playing in that way, because eventually you'll just end up with no one to play with if it's too frustrating, or you'll end up getting countered if it isn't. And that means that people who are particularly familiar with each other and don't have that interest in being annoying don't often do this at all. They'll look for holes in the other player's position, look for moments they can get whiff punishes, etc., but they're not looking for the same level of frustration. We generally refer to them as frustration players, but it's not even quite that in the case of what you just saw. Because understanding how to frustrate another player is not the same as understanding how to overwhelm them, or to emotionally mess with them until they can't do something else. A frustration player style works basically all the way to the top. Whereas the other method tends to fizzle out again around the gold ranks, because the platinum players, while they will occasionally fall for it, they will get tired of losing to it because it's not a strong enough strategy to really push on them. They either have enough damage output that the little being poked at doesn't really matter as much, they'll just find a way to shut you down from playing altogether with their own pressure until something happens. Or they know the counter to whatever it is you're doing, and often that counter is doing nothing at all. We are trained at the lower levels of this game to try to find a way to prevent the opponent from doing something, but it's often not necessary at all. A good example from the Honda matchup that you saw earlier would be that after a while, Honda doing headbutt doesn't mean anything to you. He could do something after it, but the something after it is either probably going to be EX butt slam or dash forward into throw. Because nearly nothing else he does actually opens you up, causes you any stresses, nothing, because the headbutt doesn't leave him close enough to go for throws, he generally doesn't click that easily with his crouch medium kick, etc. There's almost always a way to just ignore him. If you have managed to get even the smallest of life leads, even the chip is not that big a deal. You'll just eventually win anyway. But the sort of player that looks at the situation of being consistently forced to block the same move and goes, okay, thanks, I've won, you can keep doing that forever. It takes a while for many of us to get there. People are willing to do that on the offense side, but it's a little bit harder to get yourself to do it on the defense side because you're so conditioned to try to do something. And this is good in many ways. That is the part that bots can help with. Understanding what a character is capable of, so that you know what doesn't work, means that if you fight an opponent where you can't figure out what to do, you can more easily go, you know what, I probably don't have an option. Maybe this person figured out the perfect range for this, because none of the things I normally do against a bot work, and I know there's this range for the bot where I can't do anything. Maybe they just keep on using that range forever. And if they have, and you've lost a couple of rounds trying to counter it, one of the ways that most fighting games work is that the safest possible thing to do is also the least rewarding. This is how balance is. You will hear about it vehemently from many people if that is not the case. If the opponent has something they can do that is nearly no risk to them but has a gigantic payoff, someone will make it very clear that this is really bad game design. You wouldn't even have to be someone who goes on Twitter to find out that way. Someone will complain, like, seriously. Enough that you will hear it somewhere else. What you will not see or hear is whiff punish, light kick with light uppercut. Because those are not, strictly speaking, whiff punishes in the sense you'd be expecting. This is where we've often spoken about rhythms that cause players to win or lose. If you found a specific timing that your opponent, their natural flow causes them to move at a timing right after your attack. And the thing you tend to do then beats whatever they normally do, then you've won by pure rhythm. You don't have to do a lot of thinking, because then you're automatically pressing on their stressors. You're just doing a thing that they lose to, but in order to not lose to it, they would have to suppress an entire reaction set that they've probably trained quite a lot, because it might be that the rhythm helps them a lot and normally, or it's just a good idea technically. This is an actual strong option sometimes, to do something that defeats your opponent's best option despite being extremely risky. This is particularly frustrating if you have enough of a life lead. And that is technically why frustration players manage this for long periods.
You win.
And that is how you end up with the birth of the style of play we saw earlier, because it's correct when you think about it. The key would be to get the life lead and keep on trying to win by rhythm or by doing frustrating things, because it's extremely difficult to lose the life lead in that situation.
Let's do this.
Well, I won't bother changing the controls this time. It's not absolutely necessary. In fact, the only thing I do with the L2 button is turn it off. Partially because I'm really too twitchy on this and tend to hit it somehow when doing other things. But that's not likely to be terrible right now, so the important thing to hear is not Kiko show things. If you find yourself becoming frustrated at an opponent who takes actions at the timings you don't expect them to and you keep on getting hit, a good option in almost all cases is to backdash, because if you were hitting buttons and losing, backdashing will normally mean you have gotten out of the situation without any danger. And if it doesn't mean that, it means that the opponent will use a very long advancing move, which most of the time is blockable. So if you backdash a couple times, you might be able to just block. They'll eventually run out of meter or something.
Fight.
The other aspect of rhythm is that rhythm helps players who have spent a lot of time training with punishes for another reason. If you're really expecting your opponent to do something, and you have the timing for it, you can defeat a lot of things. After that, it's just a matter of awareness.
You win.
The key to understanding all your options in any match is not really about knowing what your opponent's going to do, but what you can prevent yourself from taking damage from.
Round 2. Fight. You win.
But I think the lounge was just us two a moment ago. Please note the other one is much more full, so if you do want to fight anyone here, you have to do on this side. But actually, regardless of whether or not it's actually full, I will do some changes of buttons now to once again rotate around. Once again, remember this is 3 rounds, first to 2 with character select on to facilitate our rotation.
Let's do this.
It's partially that fighting against higher level players can therefore feel like it's more fun, because their intention is entirely different. Being able to do more things to counter what you are doing means that they're just more likely to do those things. They move faster, they have more options, they generally have more confidence. But all that's really happened a lot of the time is that rather than there being 1 or 2 situations that the player knows is advantageous to them that they repeat, your opponent knows like 6 situations that are advantageous to them, and they alternate and flow between those. At maximum level play, especially in what we are generally considering bad matchups, sometimes even high level players only have 1, 2, or maybe 3 good positions or options, and the match devolves into them trying to stay at those. Of course, with really high level players, you do see a lot more powerful combos, a lot more specifically effective execution, and other things that make it a little more fabulous. But then there's like Akuma versus Manat, which is going to be about the same no matter how many times you do it. Technically, Akuma versus Mika can be very similar because of because of Mika's strong corner guard and Akuma's relatively lower health. Once Akuma is cornered, the level to which Mika has an advantage is borderline ridiculous. And I think the only real counter Akuma actually even has is doing like overhead from really far away or EX Fireball. Now, the simple answer to this is, hey, try not to get cornered, and Akuma can definitely avoid getting cornered against Mika for a certain relatively large amount of time. But once he is cornered, you should generally think of it as, well, he better use some meter or hope that the opponent makes a mistake, because without it, he's just going to get pummeled. There's very little he can actually do about it. This doesn't necessarily mean that the matchup is bad, because in order for this to work, the Mika player has to have really good reactions, first of all, and secondarily, generally needs to try to play footsies, even though Akuma could relatively easily beat a lot of that footsies. This was something we saw when the characters first came out. I think we spoke about it a really long time ago.
Round 1.
Akuma doesn't need to play footsies with Mika, he more so needs to disregard the fact that this is possible. But in order to do this enough, he also has to stress out the opposing Mika player. And this usually involves like some forward dashes, or some really well-spaced stand medium punches. Options like that are the ones that mostly come up there, because otherwise, again, Mika will generally win in footsies and you basically can't leave the ground. Because of the same thing, she's generally prepared for you to do those things.
Round 2. Fight.
But it's not as if Mika just gets to go, okay, well, I'm gonna push you to the corner immediately and corner guard my way to victory. Akuma has to give up that space a lot of the time. And honestly, he doesn't have a lot of good reasons to do so. Meaning that this match is actually heavily based on Justifi's reactions, more so than anything else. Choices and stress also come into it, as you've just seen twice. But the overall concept is still the same, because the demon flip works when the Mika player believes that footsies is going to happen. Once you've convinced them that, okay, I'm not playing footsies right now, I'm demon flipping, then they will go back to the mental state, the relatively calm mental state of, okay, I'll wait and I'll do wingless.
It's go time.
Since it's relatively easy to build up meter in the matchup, it's not often that she's going to be starved for it. She doesn't use it for command mix-ups as much. She doesn't need to. Depending on what you want to practice, though, you can look for other ways of dealing with the situation. Because even matchups that feel terribly bad because you either don't have the reactions, or your opponent keeps repeating something that you feel so strongly there's a counter to, but you don't know it yet. Getting yourself to focus on doing the other parts of the matchup, such as meter watching, can be really helpful. In fact, substituting taking stock of everyone's meters for I should take a movement now is one of the fastest ways to stop yourself from doing too many things. Because we're used to just glancing at meters, and you can build up the skill where you just, oh, okay, I've looked at it, I know approximately where we are. But approximately isn't necessarily as good as, okay, I know exactly where we are. Especially when you're playing a match like this, and the specifics of, can I grab the opponent or not? Do I have enough time for this? What's their mental state relative to their meter? Did they just get meter? Are they likely to uppercut out of my stuff, etc.? All of these things matter a lot more. Another really good reason why this helps is because it prevents you from falling into that mental state of, okay, I should stop moving in order to win, because you only get a couple of seconds of that, if even a second. In faster paced games, you pausing for a second lets your opponent know that you have detensed your nerves, but probably you've detensed your nerves so much that if they want to dash in and throw you or something, you're not going to do anything about it. This is largely what makes dash throw stronger than jumping, even though jumping hits much harder when the opponent is pressing buttons. Dash throw is the counter to someone who is trying to relax and get their control back. But if you've actually mentally put yourself in the space of, I'm checking my meters, I'm checking the meters in general, do I have the reversal, do they have the reversal, how close are we to V-trigger? You can do that in about, let's say a split second. In that split second, once it's over, you can then let yourself go back into, okay, what's going on the screen now, what should I be pressing, how should I counter my opponent? And if you've trained it even a little bit, Sakura bot is our general method for this. Kami bot also helps, but she tends to, you have to put in the Kami bot really well before it matters. That moment is not usually long enough for your opponent to think, oh, I'm just going to get a free dash up throw now. You might actually manage to check them. And you will quickly notice when you try to get in on someone who just does like crouch like punch, for example, when they think you're coming at them. This is actually really hard. And it should be, because crouch light punch will be advantaged, even if at max range. And you shouldn't just get to be neutral / advantaged for this. When you have decided, I think your guard is down, I'm gonna dash up. It's best if you take some damage. For game balance purposes, it's best if you take a little damage, but definitely don't get to keep your advantage. And a light punch is a good way to have that work out. Characters that have good combos off their light punches, non-counter hit versions, tend to be in good positions, and some people prefer to use light kicks, even though those tend to be disadvantaged, because quite a few characters do have light kicks that actually do something. Even if they don't specifically lead to combos, they end up somehow giving you enough of an advantage in spacing or similar that it matters. But once again, as noted, no amount of training that sort of thing is going to make a difference against someone whose goal is to overload you by repeating something that is confusing or stressful to you. The only thing you can generally do is either remove the stress or accept that the opponent isn't playing in the way you want them to.
Round 2. Fight.
And getting frustrated because your opponent is not playing the way you want is a really fast way to lose in any fighting game. The problem is that unlike most other games where this can be chalked up to differences in character ability to the point of imbalance, or really bad matchups, which is how it used to be in the old games, most people have agreed that these games are fairly balanced. And in fact, that might be why people end up upset these days. Most games have enough balance that even the worst matchups these days don't approach anywhere near what the old ones were like. meaning you almost always have an option, but it might not be the best option. Which heavily raises the requirements for all of these. Hey, I'm gonna sit here and think for a couple seconds. I'm gonna do this thing that makes sure I don't get stressed out, etc. But
You lose.
this also means that a large aspect of the games is to put that amount of stress on the opponent. It's that tension that causes us to watch high-level play, most of us anyway. To see the many, many layers of things that people are encountering.
Round one. Fight.
And this is what makes the beauty of the strategy seen before. The less mistakes you can make, the more stressed your opponent is, because the more likely they are to feel as if they're the one playing badly. And technically, that's correct. A person who spends a lot of time trying to whiff punish in a difficult whiff punish matchup, failing consistently, is probably going to lose the match. They have to practice for long hours to get to the point where they do it so consistently that the tables get turned, that the player who is occasionally hitting the button, in order to attempt to get it to happen, to make the opponent try the whiff punish and fail it, every time they do it, then it actually does get whiff punished and they take a lot of damage. But without that, if they can't force you to make a mistake by sticking out the button and they just get hurt every time they try, their options dwindle very quickly. Meaning that when they face a particularly practiced opponent, whether or not that player is actually strong emotionally or otherwise, just enough practice on the thing that they're doing that they think will stress you out means that eventually they leave off with nearly nothing to do. One of the things that comes up in this case a lot that has been discussed with Just Fine recently is in fact Mika's drop kick and crouch heavy punch. Both of these moves generally require your opponent to be stressed out enough for them to work. Not that they don't do much of anything, they still do stuff. But understanding how to push people into doing things at that point is hard enough that you have to read the room, basically. You have to know that moment to do it based on that. But there's no way to build up that skill other than by doing it.
It's go time.
Alright then, let's change that one more time. Yeah. Not the thing I wanted. And for simplicity, we'll do that as well. I'll try to find out from the wolf if the other lounge is completely full at this time. If not, we may have someone migrate there temporarily, depending on what we're doing time-wise tonight. From what I can tell, they're doing well. can help sometimes to have a secondary character whose entire job is to change your mindset in one shot. This is also something we've mentioned before. Sometimes I play Colleen simply because on Chun-Li I want to hit buttons all of the time. On Colleen sometimes I don't feel like doing anything at all. It's much easier to just not do anything. Or to stop after doing something because it's just feels more natural to just go, okay, that's done, so yeah. But this is exactly the same thing I was talking about before. The problem with playing Colleen is that a lot of the time, I just don't do enough. I end up in that state where my nerves are all, like, calm now, and I can't do anything. If I needed to actually stop a lot of the things that are happening, I just don't. I look at the opponent doing something and think, I should probably act, but I don't even remember what I feel like doing right now. Because it does take a certain amount of priming. Top players will easily tell you this. There's a lot of priming involved in your better options against certain things. So actually, the optimal option here for a Suntier is to play more like the same purple I was talking about before. Do a lot of things. Until I change mode again. Not necessarily because it is easy to get me to be stressed and overwhelmed when I'm playing Colleen, but because I refuse to be. And she specifically has a lot of very precise requirements about how she deals with situations. You can't hit the same buttons, you can't keep the opponent as quiet because she doesn't have the same amount of range, and footsies is a little different. If you don't jump, she has a lot of different things she can't do anymore. And fireballs and throws are a good option against a lot of things regardless. She does have an option against projectiles from far away, but getting myself to deal with it is a lot of practice. This is actually one of the easier ways to play against people who you normally are able to defeat without holding back truly. You simply let go, don't push your feelings as hard, let's say.
You win.
Fortunately for Colleen, as a character, her rhythm is good for this purpose. You can put yourself in positions on screen where your opponent doesn't have a lot of options relative to that. And if you can space yourself correctly, the thing that normally defeats you is fireballs. And the reason why this is fine is because it takes too long to take enough damage through fireballs for most things to be bothering. Wait, those are airborne, I think. Yes, they are. Oh well.
Round 2. Fight. Final round. Fight. You win.
Learning how to take advantage of your own particular style can be hard to push through when that style generally causes you to lose in one way or another. Because it's a strong instinct to fix the thing about your style that makes you lose particular things. When you start to get to the very abstract ones like I move too often, or I don't pay enough attention in neutral, or I don't tech throws, all of these things are weaknesses. But because we can only have so much mental space to keep doing things, especially for long periods, most people have to give up something. And we've observed this at the highest levels for a very long time. Until most people have practiced a game for years, they generally drop something. I'm informed by the Wolf that there are currently 3 slots open in that lounge if you wish to join it. So you can head on over that way. It is almost certainly 3 rounds for us to again, probably. And you'll get a lot more variety than on this side.
Round 2. Fight. You win.
Understanding enough about how people tend to do things can get you fairly far in games like this. Human beings, as a general rule, have particular tendencies, like I'll do this thing twice and then this other thing once, which is how that counter happened. And the reason this is important in games like this is because if the thing they're doing the first 2 times doesn't do enough damage that you care about getting hit by it twice, then you probably could figure out something you could do about it. This is why jumping is a big deal early, because it is one of those things that actually hurts most people at start, because most people learn their jumping combos pretty quickly. But understanding that is by itself enough to get you certain distances. Because in that case, you can focus mainly on learning your own tools for those same situations. One tool that I have, for example, not been using much in this so far is Colleen's air throw, which is a thing I normally use a lot. But in terms of the aforementioned, I basically never tech throws. We've talked about this before. And I'm not going to build a skill for teching throws because people don't throw me in the timings that would matter. They throw me in the timings where it's best for me to take the throw rather than worry about something else happening.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight!
If I play Colleen in a very active way, in which I'm constantly either doing something or, let's say, stressing out my nerves, for lack of a better term, then what will eventually happen is that I'll get hit by dealing with too many things or trying to counter too many things. And without the actual massive amount of practice required to always do the correct counter, which I'm nowhere near, that's not going to lead to anything good. But it is the correct answer to this matchup when the opponent plays in an offensive way. The other answer would be the exact thing I mentioned before. Playing without actually spending too much time letting the opponent do anything, because I just keep on playing really defensively myself. Because the fireballs are jumpable, they are counterable in another way, there's just nothing specific that they are threatening for except when you are trying to play a different flow forward. Akuma backing off or moving to specific optimal positions and throwing the projectile means that she just lacks certain options. But you can see how the optimal thing there would be to never actually move and just block them all, for the most part. There are ways around the situation. Are they interesting? It depends on what you consider interesting. But it can be frustrating to lose in that way, because your opponent is doing something you know there is a solution to, but you keep on falling for it. You keep on getting defeated by it. You have to do a lot of work to prevent this from happening, whereas it's easy to fall into the perspective that they just have to throw the fireball, or that they just have to do X, Y, Z, whatever that is. But all you could say to yourself is you just have to block. You don't have to actually respond at all. Especially with a character who has a way through the move that is just sometimes hard to use on reaction. While I'm not going to demonstrate it, because it's technically already been demonstrated, Colleen using the light version of Vanity Step, the one that punches through things, evades projectiles. And this does about 3 times as much damage to Akuma than even getting hit by 3 of Akuma's fireballs does to Colleen. So you really don't have to care a lot. Plus, you have that option. Therefore, if you were seeing a different player at this point, you'd expect them to keep doing that. And it would be functionally the correct thing to do, because there's no loss to them for doing it repeatedly. this situation isn't specifically useful to Suntier. No matter how many projectiles are thrown from here, the only thing they are now is a risk. Which makes it a lot of calculations of life leads. You can therefore get good enough at it that if you could get an early enough life lead, your opponent's options stop mattering as much. Or you get to do crazier things on your end. However, you can convert this into an actual style of play, simply because you have to understand how much it stresses an opponent when you disregard something they're doing as well. It's not easy to see, and you do have to have a certain level of skill in keeping up and skill in analyzing how much damage you're really taking, which is hard for most people to actually get used to. But a good example here would be, I am used to this enough that I'll just get hit by every fireball. Why? Because it actually is more rewarding to get all of the situations where my opponent is throwing more fireballs. This comes up a lot in games like this. Your opponent is doing the optimal thing for the matchup, but to do it correctly isn't particularly threatening if your mindset is in a particular place. If you are constantly defending well enough that it's the only thing that they're doing that's actually being effective, you don't actually care. That, on the other hand, is still what we were referring to before. It's not that I don't know the throw is coming, it's that I just don't have the tendency or the physical, like, my nerves are not in a place where I'll tech the throw. I don't even plan to do it. The throw will happen, and then I will do nothing. Aw, missed somehow. At this point you can put multiple stress points into one opposing sequence, and by doing this, you become capable of shifting the match's individual parts. This is how high-level players tend to dominate players who don't have as much experience, because they've created enough stress points for this to happen.
Let's do this.
Almost time to switch over once again, but I don't even have to do that. I already set the buttons. Oh, well.
貴様の全てを見せてもらう。
At most levels, this matchup is also heavily affected by this. These two characters fight at a similar range. They often do similar things, but Chun-Li wins against Seth by doing less of the things that make her open. And so far, I haven't found what Seth's counter to this is. This one I'll wait on someone else to analyze for me because of the sheer amount of difference in how people think about the game and my own bias. But yeah, generally I haven't figured out what it is that Seth does here. It's more so how many mistakes does Chun-Li make than what does Seth do. That, for example, is something I probably shouldn't be doing in the matchup at all. There's no reason to throw the Kikoken. It doesn't benefit pretty much anything. But it is habitual at the spacing that they stand at. There's a good option, for example. No matter how many times the president does that within this match, I'm probably not going to counter it. Not because Chun-Li doesn't have a counter, but because the conditioned counter to someone neutral jumping on Chun-Li's wake up in my mind is completely different. Everyone else jumps at a timing where their intention and expectation is to get away from spinning bird kick. I'm not sure whether or not the thing that is happening there would do that, but the counter for everyone else is to air throw it. That's all. You don't have to do any other work. For Seth, because Seth comes down right away and can attack from there, the answer is not to do that. The answer is to do her back heavy kick on wake up. Am I going to do it? Probably not. But getting stressed about the fact that, like, I can literally think and say right now, oh, well, I'm gonna get down and I'm gonna get jumped on and that's gonna be that, is important. Because it's a matter of knowing that you have an answer, but not getting stressed about your inability to do the answer, because you either haven't trained it or have enough conditioning of another type. I actually don't know whether or not the thing I was trying to do there works either, because I haven't tested it in large enough detail. Generally, I do this sort of thing by straight analysis, and I figure that you can just do EX legs and go over that, which was the plan, but I think I tapped the button when I didn't mean to or something. Well, there's the Chun-Li made more mistakes. It's important not to let those sorts of things bother you. Your opponent is generally doing what they've been conditioning themselves to do for a while. But it is the explanation for why playing in ways that don't involve taking risks yourself end up being common ways of playing at a certain level. Because overwhelming an opponent with your raw offense is actually way harder than waiting for them to mess themselves up. But here we have that moment, the life lead. And again, I'm not going to stop that from happening. I should technically be proud of myself if I manage it even once.
You lose. Let's do this.
The the Seth versus Akuma match, at least in this case, tends to be the exact opposite of that. Whether or not we're actually going to see Seth versus Akuma, I'm not sure of, because we're not playing characters that off today. No, there we go. In general, it's the opposite situation. Seth has to suppress a bunch of things and not make certain mistakes, and Akuma spends more time being able to wait for those mistakes. Because Akuma doesn't really have to throw the fireball, and has a lot of better punishes at certain ranges than Chun-Li does, first of all, and a lot of better ways out of Seth's stuff. Most important of which is that we've discussed before, there's a certain range at which hitting Tatsu is very likely to get the Seth player to respond, because if they never respond to the Tatsu at that range, they have to, quote-unquote, quiet down their nerves. And if they quiet down their nerves, other forms of offense start to work too much. They get hit by fireballs and neutral, as you can just see, among other things. Mastering the correct amount of tension to hold in your body or your mind is in itself difficult. And in fact, the goal would be to hold none at all, to just automatically do nearly everything required. There are people who ascend to that level while playing these games, but it normally takes a lot of time. Sort of person is the Japanese salaryman that goes to the arcade every day for 30 minutes after work every day and just grinds through everything for as long as possible. There's certainly nothing stopping us from being those same sorts of people, but when you really dedicated yourself to it, you tend to have a different perspective on the whole thing as well. Because in an arcade situation, you get to stop playing when you lose, so your concept of what exactly is acceptable or fun may be different. The sort of person who doesn't find it fun to play in the optimal way doesn't spend too much time in the arcade because they tend to lose their money. It is partially that arcade culture plus a couple other things that resulted in the way that we were in the FGC for a very long time. You just play the strongest character, play the optimal way. If you came up with something altogether cool on a new character, or picked a new character because you felt you could take a certain opponent down without your best character or your best tactics, you got to learn some things, but at the end of the day, the default method for play once things got stressful was different. However, at the highest levels of play, it's still very similar for a lot of people. So characters that get the unfortunate distinction of being considered inconsistent, let's say, tend to be shunned at least a little bit. If you have to take too many risks to do something, the character tends to be a little less popular. Even if they have high health like Abigail, probably it doesn't matter. You'll just go, okay, well, this is good and everything, but you'll mostly find those characters being taken up as the secondary to an extremely strong player's main character that is good at just dominating. This is in fact really common in the FGC right now. You'll find a lot of players have a secondary that can be more technical, can also be extremely rewarding in a specific way, but they won't necessarily consider that character their main character, because they perceive and understand that there's some relatively meaningful risk to playing them in some way. There are some loyalists like Tokido and to some extent Mashable, but I don't think he's like that anymore. And Bonchan had his own specific input because Sagat's not really a character where you have to take a lot of risks, but it's similar to Manat where if your opponent does too many crazy things it gets frustrating. For example, Suntier here in an arcade, Suntier wins here because 26 seconds left. The correct answer would basically have been don't throw any fireballs, don't do anything, just stand there and win.
Seth wins.
The level of answer required to enjoy this game now, though, is different. It isn't even, well, ignore it and throw the fireball. It's more so, how can I use the fact that my opponent is waiting for me to make a mistake to win the match in the way I would like. Often this means spending the next 20 seconds convincing the opponent that you're going to attack them until they're so on edge that they make a mistake themselves, or because they refuse to push themselves to risk anything at that point, they run out of time before they can do anything to you. This is a common timeout situation in high-level play now.
Round one. Fight.
Forced errors are not a very easily noted thing at high level right now. Mainly because the characters that have been added recently are popular for various reasons, which I don't always understand, but are not good at causing forced errors. Gil is okay at it, but that's more so, do you have the physical skill to deal with Gil? And Seth is, for the most part, terrible at it, but has a lot of damage if you do happen to make a mistake, so that's important as well. One of the few characters that can actually force a mistake and still has that level of damage is G. In fact, I think technically he's the only character like that now. Zangief used to be able to do it, but that was more so a matter of people not understanding how to deal with a certain thing he does than him being able to actually force very much. And Abigail used to have the ability, but certain nerfs took it away, mostly things related to command grab range. And most people were kind of happy that that happened because it was overwhelming in certain situations. But for the most part, current, new and popular characters don't have a lot of that. We don't know what will happen with the newer ones that are coming up. After all, one more season to go apparently. But right now the state of the game is mostly that. People are often playing characters that don't really force errors. And therefore you need to somewhat build up the skill of making those people who play these characters doubt whether or not you've made an error at all. And you don't need perfect execution to do this because technically a lot of characters have moves that come out in the same spaces, but the player can't tell if you intended to do that or not. And a lot of the time the moves that come out are not blatantly obvious mistakes. The question is, wait, was that a read? Were they trying to beat me out on this? And the amount of time it takes you just to process this results in nothing really. But as you can see here from Seth, it's not really that Seth is particularly good at this. Seth moves are a little too slow, and even normals and target combos don't really lead to that sort of overwhelming,
You win.
crushing you for doing anything wrong that characters like G and to some extent Zeku, for example, have. Only really old form Zeku. Young form Zeku is not really good at this.
Round one. Fight.
Fortunately for most Seth players, the damage output of the character is decent enough to get you somewhere. And you only really have to worry about Rashid and Karine. Despite Karine having low health, she generally has so much control of the matter that even the fact that Seth will defeat her in 3 interactions doesn't matter because he doesn't get the 3 interactions. But it is also literally Seth will win in 3 interactions. And if that frustrates you, then you're not really understanding the purpose here. Given the amount of time it takes to set this up, the amount of effort it takes, and the fact that a high enough level Karine with an actual understanding of how to control Seth's movement will just never get hit. Means that technically the Seth player is usually the one suffering in the matchup. That, for example, if baited, would have been the end. But one still has to spend a lot of time practicing offense if you want to do this. It is part of the reason why we actually will sometimes suggest that players all the way up until gold actually spend a lot of time on bots in the basic sense of it. Because depending on your character, you might have gotten to gold without specifically gaining a lot of the skills required to take you past it, whereas other characters stay in bronze or silver because they don't have enough overwhelm to do it. But this is a good example of the type of round I'm talking about. Little interactions between Karine and Seth generally mean that Karine has almost complete control of the match, until Seth does something crazy. But once Seth gets a couple of hits in, it's half-life off of basically 2 interactions, and if V-Trigger was available, the rest would be gone in 1. But that doesn't change much, because if you were a player willing to play, able to play to the point of basically perfecting your opponent for 40 seconds, and they landed the hit to take half your health, you just have to do it again for another 40 seconds. This is one of the things that Fantasy Strike, I believe it was, supposed to teach you, that in certain games, the number of times you get touched, the number of times you lose control of neutral or similar, is the whole game. If your opponent's skills at doing their combos are high enough, that's it. So we currently have Dragon Ball Fighters and its various touch of death combos, for example. One of the downsides for this, for people who learn strong combos, is that it's easy to end up with the feeling that matches are either unfair because high-level players never let you touch them ever to use your combos, or come to the conclusion that you're doing particularly well when your opponent spent most of their time unable, keeping you from being able to hit them altogether, and then made one mistake. Your opponent making one mistake, no matter how good you are, if you can take half their health in that one mistake, it's not really that you're specifically playing super well unless you forced that mistake. Because eventually you will reach an opponent who simply doesn't make the mistake, one way or the other, and you will just not hit them ever. A large part of offense in this game is learning to bait the opponent into reacting to things that are not good ideas. And it's that knowledge that leads to this outcome for so many players. People get tired of being tricked, people get tired of being confused, and therefore they spend their time doing as little as possible except when they've seen a blatantly obvious mistake on the opponent's side.
It's go time.
Alright then, let's rotate back then.
Let's do this.
And since Santir got off the Colleen train and ended up fighting Seth, I'll return to Chun-Li before we rotate again. It's unknown how long the secondary lounge will stay open. This one is probably going to be going for a while longer actually, but the stream will not. This is not necessarily the last match on stream, but we're getting there. So expect, depending on how many matches this is, to see either just fine play or not.
Round 2. You win.
But in the end, all of this means that the fact that this can be analyzed to this level, in general, means that this is like any other game. You play it long enough, you learn to enjoy playing it based on the parameters that it is, or decide you don't want to play it because you don't like that type of game. Once you know what type of game you are up against, and you've decided you either like playing it or don't, you can then say, I will get better. Because you probably will get better. Every single small thing you learn to react to, every situation you learn to understand your opponent's stress level in, every anti-air that works because you actually know, every anti-air you can force to not work because you realize your spacing is correct for that. All of these things are just straight improvements that can't really be lost in the sense that other games would make you think. Because in most other games, once you learn to fight a boss, you know how to do it, and if you don't know how to fight it or they decide to change the boss, that's it. You just have to learn a new pattern. Here, this isn't true so much. But one more shift, and once again, lounge will stay open. We are continuing to play, at least for a while longer. Also, the lounge owner will not change. There will be no more stream to tell you which of us is going to be playing, but, I mean, based on characters, it'll be fairly obvious. Just don't go into any given match expecting to see a very specific opponent. This, therefore, is our last on-stream set of the night. And we're fairly certain that tomorrow's content is either a smaller lounge or nothing at all, as we have a bunch of other things that we have planned. That said, if it is going to happen, you're going to see Unclear, Under Night, and Wednesday is equally likely to be similar. You might see something, but it's more likely we'll be doing something else. Therefore, our consistent content continues to be this Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with its various changes in format, and our Dead or Alive 6 Lounge 60 times, which does not generally change in format. We don't expect to have another house rotation next week, but you never know. You may be able to see more information on bots on individual channels going forward, but this won't necessarily be like this guidance or similar. As mentioned before, there are a lot of specialized ways that we use bots for training that don't necessarily even correspond to the bot's written purpose. Sometimes they do, but not in the same way you'd expect. Like, you might notice slight variations in the aims, or the player doing things that wouldn't necessarily lead to the optimal outcomes in terms of, hey, this is the points you're supposed to get, or even the extreme version, because we do spend a lot of time developing specific ways to use bots to improve and fix minor known problems in our styles. For example, using ZakuBot to make sure that you're not so committed to chasing people, which I've done recently, or different wake-up timings that CamiBot can help with depending on your CamiBot input. We got a couple good CamiBots that do a good job of this. So if you see any of these floating around, feel free to ask what the purpose was. But these are not going to be on the main channel. You'll have to find team member channels for this. It's not necessarily too hard to do. Though not everyone actually has the 2MK marker.
You win.
The other lounge is also still open. The amount of time it will remain that way is unknown. You're looking for duo. That is more likely to change than the lead of this lounge is. As for bots that we keep mentioning, you can find them at 2-mk.org. You can get straight to them by inputting /bots or /sf5 sfv-bots. If you're interested in bots for other games, note that unfortunately certain other games don't let you save the bots. In fact, I think the only one that technically does is Dragon Ball. Dragon Ball is just one that you change parameters for. But for, unfortunately, things like Under Night, you actually have to input it every time, and Dead or Alive is even worse, because you just can't actually do anything else once you've input it. Can't change character, can't change color, nothing. You're locked into that once you've started. But, depending on what you're interested in, you can find all of those there.
Round 2. Fight.
But we wish you luck with all of your training, whether or not you are a defensive powerhouse or an edgelord of offense like myself.
Final round. Fight.
Because either way, you probably have a lot of practicing to do, either to get up to gold or to get out of it. Beyond that, of course, this content of ours is probably not for you unless you somehow enjoy watching us try to muddle through all of the little things that fighting games require. It's relatively well known / presented that it's difficult to get particularly good at these games with insufficient practice. And that can mean having a regular amount of time to game or just having other interests in other games. But our goal is always to more so make sure that the player understands why they're losing, even if that can sometimes be in itself more so stressful or depressing than not. Is this set gonna go on even longer? Looks like maybe. But it's hard to tell because Bison's view reversal is too strong. Setting up situations that suit you can end up being really easy. But we see the same thing here, once again.
You lose. Round one. Fight.
So I guess for our closing we get to watch that particular outcome. Because Justine is probably the one most among us willing to just let the opponent time themselves out. Because that is technically sometimes what we see the game as. The opponent is able to do things, but is not relatively willing to risk doing the things. So just avoid making mistakes of your own and hopefully everything works out. But again, execution tests require you to practice something. And you can only continue to hope that all of the effort you put in practicing it leads you to a place where your opponent must then practice something. So if you find yourself having trouble with such things, push through it best you can. I can't promise you it gets better, honestly. But it does become something that can be understood. And with that understanding, you can make an informed decision about how much you feel like playing the game on any given day, who you feel like playing against, which character you want to deal with and don't want to deal with. All of these things become available to you as straight up conscious decisions that don't necessarily burn your brain. And that Psycho Crusher brings us to the end of our stream for tonight.
You win.
Good luck with your training, and good night, everyone.